A millionaire loses everything and is helped by a poor boy on the street. The simple gesture reveals a past marked by mistakes and arrogance. While struggling to survive, he discovers betrayals that led to his ruin. Now he must rebuild his life and keep his promise to help the boy who changed everything. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. At the top of the imposing Golden Tower, a symbol of the financial power of New York, Richard Miller gazed at the city he once believed was at his feet. At 45, he was the picture of success, president of one of the largest construction companies in the country, owner of an enviable fortune, and admired by all. His impeccable suit and gold watch were just details in the portrait of a seemingly perfect life. On that sunny Thursday morning, Richard was about to close the biggest deal of his career, the acquisition of a competitor that would make him the undisputed leader in the market. With a confident smile, he entered the meeting room where his partners and lawyers were waiting. "Gentlemen, today is the day we change the game," he announced, his voice resonating with confidence. The next few hours were filled with heated discussions, astronomical figures, and the signing of contracts that, in Richard's eyes, solidified his empire. Little did he know that, while he toasted to his success, silent gears were already in motion to dismantle everything he had built. Days later, at his mansion in the Hamptons, Richard relaxed by the pool, sipping whiskey while his wife, Claire, organized yet another charity event. His children, Luke and Marina, played carefree, oblivious to the storm that was approaching. Then his phone rang. On the other end, the trembling voice of his accountant brought alarming news. "Mr. Miller, something's wrong. Our funds, they've just disappeared." Richard felt the ground give way beneath him. In the weeks that followed, an avalanche of revelations hit him. Forged documents, secret negotiations, emptied accounts. His empire, built over decades, crumbled like a sandcastle. The press, once an ally, now crucified him. Sensationalist headlines filled newspapers and magazines. The fall of the Miller Empire. Richard Miller from tycoon to beggar. Each word was a dagger to his pride. On a grey morning, bailiffs knocked on his door. With a lump in his throat, Richard watched helplessly as his assets were inventoried and confiscated. Furniture, artwork, luxury cars, everything was taken before his eyes. Claire, unable to handle the humiliation, packed her bags in silence. "I can't live like this, Richard. The kids and I are going to my mother's," she said, avoiding his gaze. The children, confused and scared, said reluctant goodbyes. Alone in the now empty mansion, Richard faced the deafening silence of his new reality. The walls, once witnesses to glamorous parties, now echoed only the sound of his lost footsteps. The final blow came when, on a rainy afternoon, he was evicted from his own home. TV cameras captured the moment Richard Miller, once powerful, walked out the gates with just a suitcase in hand. The shouts of reporters and the flash of cameras etched the image of his disgrace into the collective memory. Lost and disoriented, Richard wandered the streets of New York. The city that once revered him now ignored him. Busy executives passed by without a second glance, as if he were invisible. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of anonymity. That night, he took shelter under the awning of a closed store. The light rain seemed to wash away the last remnants of his former life. As he watched the cars go by, Richard wondered how he had reached this point. Memories of his rise tormented him. He remembered the ambitious young man who started as an intern, the sleepless nights working on projects, the risky decisions that took him to the top. Now it all seemed like a distant dream. The cold night enveloped him, bringing with it a cruel reality. Richard Miller, the man who once had everything, now had nothing. No family, no friends, no money. Just him and the indifferent streets of a city that never sleeps. As the first light of dawn painted the sky, Richard found himself at a crossroads. He could succumb to despair or find the strength to start over. The journey ahead would be the hardest of his life, but something within him, a spark of determination he didn't even know still existed, urged him to move forward. With the first rays of sunlight, Richard stood up. His once impeccable suit was now wrinkled and dirty, but in his eyes a new resolve shone. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to rise again. The fall had been swift, but the climb back promised to be even more challenging. And so Richard Miller took his first steps in a New York that no longer recognized him, heading toward an uncertain future that, for the first time in a long time, depended solely on him to be built. The rising sun painted the skyscrapers of New York with golden hues, but for Richard Miller, the world seemed to have lost all its color. His first full day on the streets unfolded like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten in almost 24 hours. With hesitant steps, Richard wandered through the city center. His eyes, once focused on million-dollar contracts, now desperately searched for something edible. That's when he spotted a bustling bakery. The smell of fresh bread drew him like a magnet, but shame kept him from entering. Standing on the sidewalk, he watched people coming and going with bags full of food. An elderly woman passed by, giving him a pitying look before placing a few coins in his hand. Richard felt his face burn with humiliation. He, who had once signed million-dollar checks, was now receiving handouts. With the coins, he bought a loaf of bread at the bakery. The first sip of hot coffee was like a balm to his wounded soul. Sitting on a park bench, Richard watched the hustle and bustle of the city. Busy executives, animated students, street vendors, all seemed to have a purpose except him. As he slowly chewed his bread, Richard was approached by a ragged man. "Hey, buddy, you got a piece of that bread to spare?" the stranger asked with a toothless grin. Instinctively, Richard clutched what was left of the bread to his chest, feeling threatened. The man, sensing his fear, let out a hoarse laugh. "Relax, buddy. I know how it is at first. Name's Joe, and you?" Richard hesitated before answering. "Richard," he murmured, avoiding eye contact. Joe sat down beside him, ignoring Richard's obvious discomfort. "First night on the streets, huh? I can see it in your eyes. Look, if you want some survival tips, just ask." The idea of needing survival tips was surreal to Richard. Just days ago, his biggest concern was choosing between his yacht or private jet for the weekend. Now he was receiving advice from a homeless man. Joe kept talking, sharing information about shelters, safe places to sleep, and where to get free meals. Richard listened in silence, torn between gratitude for the help and shame at his new condition. As the day progressed, the reality of his situation became increasingly palpable. The midday heat gave way to a stifling afternoon, and Richard felt sweat trickling down his back, sticking his dress shirt to his skin. He decided to follow one of Joe's suggestions and looked for a municipal shelter. The line at the entrance was long, filled with tired faces and life stories he never imagined he'd know. When it was finally his turn, the attendant looked at him with suspicion. "Full name?" the clerk asked, not looking up from the computer. "Richard Miller," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. The clerk typed something and then looked at Richard more closely. "Wait a minute. Aren't you that businessman who—" Richard felt his stomach sink. Even here at rock bottom, his past haunted him. "No, you must be confusing me with someone else," he lied, feeling small. The clerk shrugged and continued the registration. "Well, Mr. Miller, we have a spot for tonight. The rules are simple: in by 7 p.m., out by 7 a.m., no alcohol or drugs. Understood?" Richard nodded, silently grateful. At least he'd have a roof over his head that night. The next few hours were a test of patience and humility. In the shower line, Richard found himself surrounded by men with life stories as diverse as they were tragic. A former soldier who couldn't readjust to civilian life, a young addict fighting his demons, an elderly man abandoned by his family. Each story was a painful reminder of how cruel life could be. In the cafeteria, he faced another battle. The simple food was a stark contrast to the refined dinners he was used to. But hunger spoke louder, and Richard found himself devouring every bite as if it were his last. When he finally lay down on one of the dozens of bunk beds lined up in the shelter, exhaustion hit him like a wave. The thin mattress and hard pillow were a luxury compared to the previous night on the street. Closing his eyes, Richard let the tears he'd been holding back finally fall. In the silence of the night, interrupted only by snores and murmurs from his fellow unfortunates, Richard reflected on the path that had led him here. The risky decisions, The blind trust in business partners, the arrogance that made him believe he was untouchable. Each mistake weighed on his conscience like an anchor. But amidst the despair, a small flame of hope began to ignite. If he had hit rock bottom, the only way was up. The journey would be arduous, but Richard vowed to himself that he would find a way to rise again. With that thought, he fell asleep, exhausted, but determined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since his fall, Richard felt that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way back to the light. The dawn brought with it the characteristic noise of the shelter waking up. Richard opened his eyes, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The reality of his situation hit him again, but this time it came with a renewed determination. Following the shelter's routine, Richard got up early, folded his few belongings and headed out into the streets of New York. The fresh morning air carried a silent promise of possibilities. With his stomach growling, he remembered the tips Joe had given him the day before about where to get a free meal. Walking a few blocks, Richard arrived at a small church in the city center. A group of volunteers was distributing breakfast to the homeless. The line was long but moved quickly. When it was his turn, a kind-eyed woman offered him a plate with bread, fruit, and a cup of hot coffee. "Thank you," Richard murmured, still uncomfortable with the situation. The woman smiled. "You're welcome, my son. May God bless you." As he ate, Richard watched the people around him. There were diverse life stories here. Young people, the elderly, entire families, all sharing the same space, united by need. It was then that he noticed a boy, no more than 12 years old, sitting alone in a corner. The boy ate slowly, as if trying to make the meal last as long as possible. His eyes, though young, carried a maturity that touched Richard deeply. Without thinking much, he approached the boy. "Hi," Richard said hesitantly. "Can I sit here?" The boy looked at him with a mix of curiosity and caution, but nodded. "My name's Richard. And you?" "Luke," the boy replied, his voice soft but firm. A silence settled between them, broken only by the sounds of the street and the conversations around them. Richard felt he should say something, but the words escaped him. It was Luke who finally broke the ice. "It's the first time I've seen you here," the boy observed. Richard nodded. "Yes, well, it's all new to me." Luke studied him for a moment. "I can tell. Your clothes are still too nice." The observation caught Richard by surprise. It was true, his suit, though wrinkled and dirty, was still clearly of good quality. "You seem lost," Luke continued. "If you want, I can show you some good spots around here." The offer, coming from someone so young and in such difficult circumstances, touched Richard deeply. "That would be very kind of you, Luke, thank you." In the hours that followed, Richard followed Luke through the streets of downtown. The boy knew the city like the back of his hand, showing Richard sources of drinking water, safe places to rest during the day, and even a community center where they could shower and wash clothes. "How do you know all this?" Richard asked, impressed. Luke shrugged. "I've been on the streets for 2 years. You learn fast or you don't survive." The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. 2 years on the streets, and the boy was barely 12. "And your family?" he ventured to ask. Luke's face closed off for a moment. "My parents, they're gone. I have an aunt, but she can't help me. She's got her own problems." Richard felt a wave of compassion. His own situation, as bad as it was, seemed less desperate compared to Luke's. Throughout the day, Richard learned more about the boy. Luke was smart and resilient, with a wisdom that went far beyond his years. Despite the adversity, the boy maintained a spark of hope and even joy. As night began to fall, Luke led Richard to a small park. "It's safe to sleep here," he explained. "The guards don't bother us much, and there's a fountain where you can wash up in the morning." Richard looked around, noticing other homeless people settling in for the night. The reality of sleeping outdoors again scared him, but Luke's presence comforted him in some way. "Luke," Richard began hesitantly, I want to thank you for all of this." The boy smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his young face. "No need to thank me. We gotta help each other, you know." At that moment, something shifted inside Richard. The generosity of this boy, who had so little but offered so much, touched a part of his soul he thought he had lost. Tears began to form in his eyes. Luke, noticing Richard's emotion, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hey, it's gonna be okay. We learn to deal with it." Richard nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in days, he felt something other than despair and self-pity. It was a mix of gratitude, humility, and surprisingly, hope. As they settled down to sleep, Richard reflected on the day. He had lost everything: his fortune, his family, his status. But here, lying on the hard ground of a park, next to a boy he barely knew, he felt that perhaps he had gained something far more valuable. The night sky of New York, with its stars almost invisible due to the city lights, seemed less oppressive. Now, Richard closed his eyes, the sound of Luke's soft breathing beside him serving as a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, it's still possible to find light. With that comforting thought, Richard fell asleep, ready to face whatever the new day would bring. The journey would be long and difficult, but now he knew he wasn't completely alone. The dawn brought with it a fine mist that covered the streets of New York. Richard woke up with his body aching, the result of another night sleeping outdoors. Beside him, Luke was already awake, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Good morning," the boy murmured, his voice still hoarse from sleep. Richard sat up, feeling every muscle protest. "Good morning, Luke," he replied, trying to hide the discomfort. The boy looked at him with a mix of understanding and sympathy. "It gets easier, you know. Your body gets used to it." The words, though well-meaning, caused a tightness in Richard's chest. The idea of getting used to this life seemed impossible, but he forced a smile, not wanting to discourage the boy. "Come on, I know where we can get some breakfast," Luke said, already on his feet and ready to go. As they walked through the waking streets, Richard noticed how Luke moved with confidence, greeting other homeless people and avoiding certain areas with a wisdom that seemed beyond his years. They arrived at a small bakery where the owner, a middle-aged man with a kind smile, was placing unsold bread from the previous day in a box on the sidewalk. "Good morning, Mr. John," Luke greeted cheerfully. "Hello, Luke," the baker replied, his gaze turning to Richard with curiosity. "I see you've brought a friend today." Luke nodded. "This is Richard. He's new around here," Mr. John extended, his hand to Richard, who shook it, surprised by the gesture of respect. "Welcome, Richard. I hope you find what you're looking for." Richard, touched by the kindness, murmured a thank you as Luke grabbed a few loaves of bread from the box. The smell of fresh coffee coming from the bakery made his stomach growl, reminding him of the elaborate breakfasts he used to enjoy in his mansion. As they ate on a nearby bench, Luke began to share more about his daily routine. "After breakfast, I usually go to the square. Sometimes I can make a few bucks washing windshields or selling candy at the traffic lights." Richard listened attentively, a mix of admiration and sadness growing in his chest. The boy's resilience was impressive, but the injustice of his situation angered him. "Luke," he began hesitantly, "have you ever thought about going back to school?" The boy looked down, a shadow passing over his young face. "I've tried, but it's hard, you know? Without a fixed address, without a guardian. And some days, choosing between studying and eating isn't an option." The raw reality of Luke's words hit Richard like a punch. How many times had he passed by kids like Luke at traffic lights, completely ignoring them? At that moment, an idea began to form in Richard's mind. Maybe, just maybe, he could do something to help. What if I helped you get back to school?" he suggested, almost timidly. Luke looked at him with a mix of hope and skepticism. "How? You can barely help yourself, Richard." The observation, though harsh, was true. Richard found himself confronted with the reality of his own current helplessness. But something inside him refused to give up. "I may not have money or influence now, Luke, but I have knowledge. I can teach you, help you with your studies. Who knows, together we can find a way to get you enrolled again." Luke's face lit up for a moment before doubt returned. But what about the rest? Food, clothes, school supplies? Richard took a deep breath. "One step at a time. Let's start with the lessons and see where that takes us." In the days that followed, Richard and Luke established a routine. In the morning, they'd find ways to get food and a few dollars. In the afternoon, they'd find a quiet spot, usually a park or the public library, where Richard would teach math, English, and other subjects he remembered from his school days. To his surprise, Richard discovered he was a good teacher. Luke's natural curiosity and quick mind made the lessons stimulating. More than that, teaching gave Richard a purpose, something he hadn't felt since his fall. One day, as they were solving math problems using pebbles as counters, they were approached by an elegant woman passing through the park. "Excuse the intrusion," she said, "but I couldn't help but notice what you were doing. Here it's so rare to see someone dedicating time to teach like this on the street." Richard, embarrassed by his disheveled appearance, simply nodded. It was Luke who responded proudly, "Richard's helping me get back to school." The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Beatrice, listened intently to their story. Her eyes shone with a mix of compassion and determination. "You know," she said after a moment, "I'm part of an NGO that works on education for children in vulnerable situations. Maybe we can help." Richard's heart raced. Could this be the opportunity they'd been waiting for? Mrs. Beatrice took a card from her purse and handed it to Richard. "Come to our office tomorrow. Let's see what we can do." When the woman walked away, Richard and Luke exchanged glances, a mix of hope and apprehension on their faces. The possibility of real change in their lives seemed both exciting and daunting. That night, lying side by side in their corner of the park, Richard reflected on how his life had changed. Just weeks ago, he was an arrogant tycoon, concerned only with profits and status. Now his greatest joy was the possibility of helping a street kid get back to school. "Luke," he whispered in the darkness, "tomorrow could be a big day for us." The boy murmured sleepily, "Whatever it is, we'll face it together, right?" Richard smiled, feeling a wave of affection for the boy. "Yes, Luke, together." With that comforting thought, Richard fell asleep, dreaming of possibilities that, for the first time in a long time, seemed within reach. The day dawned with a palpable sense of anticipation. Richard and Luke woke up early, more anxious than usual. The promise of a visit to the NGO mentioned by Mrs. Beatrice hung over them like a cloud filled with hope. "Remember where the address is?" Luke asked as they tried to make themselves as presentable as possible with the few resources they had. Richard nodded, holding the card Mrs. Beatrice had given them like a talisman. "Yes, it's not too far from here. We can walk." They walked through the streets of New York, their steps echoing a mix of anxiety and determination. Richard noticed how Luke seemed more animated, almost skipping, a noticeable change from his usual cautious demeanor on the streets. They arrived at a modest but well-kept building in the city center. A discreet sign at the entrance read, "New Horizons, Education and Opportunities." Taking a deep breath, Richard opened the door, with Luke close behind. The interior was welcoming, with colorful walls decorated with children's drawings and motivational phrases. A receptionist greeted them with a gentle smile. "Good morning, how can I help you?" "Good morning," Richard replied, his voice betraying a bit of nervousness. "We came to speak with Mrs. Beatrice. She invited us yesterday." The receptionist nodded, understanding. "Ah, yes, she mentioned you'd be coming. Please wait a moment." Minutes later, Mrs. Beatrice appeared, her face lighting up when she saw Richard and Luke. "I'm so glad you came. Come, let's talk in my office." Mrs. Beatrice's office was cozy, filled with books and photographs of smiling children. She invited them to sit and offered water, a simple gesture that made Richard realize how long it had been since someone treated him with such consideration. "Well," Mrs. Beatrice began, "I'd like to know more about you. How did you end up in this situation?" Richard hesitated, but something in Mrs. Beatrice's understanding gaze encouraged him. He began to tell his story, the meteoric rise in business, the sudden fall, the days on the streets. His voice trembled as he spoke about meeting Luke, and how the boy had become his reason to keep going. Luke, in turn, shared his own journey, the loss of his parents, the struggles of living on the streets, his desire to return to school. Mrs. Beatrice listened attentively, her eyes shining. With a mix of compassion and determination, when they finished, she leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. "You've both been through so much," she said softly, "but I see incredible strength in both of you. Our NGO has programs that can help. She explained how the organization worked to reintegrate street children into the school system, offering not just education, but also psychological support, meals, and, in some cases, temporary housing. For you, Luke, she continued, we can start the enrollment process at one of our partner schools. You'll have tutoring to catch up with other kids your age. Luke's eyes widened, a mix of hope and disbelief on his young face. And what about Richard? The boy asked, his concern for his friend evident. Mrs. Beatrice smiled. Well, Richard, I've noticed your teaching skills. We have a volunteer program for adults in your situation. You could help with our tutoring classes while we work on your social and professional reintegration. Richard felt a lump in his throat. The idea of having a purpose again, of being able to contribute even in his current state, was almost overwhelming. That would be amazing, he managed to say, his voice choked with emotion. In the days that followed, Richard and Luke dove headfirst into the opportunities offered by the NGO. Luke began the assessment process to determine which grade he'd be enrolled in, while Richard started assisting in tutoring classes for other children. Seeing the spark in Luke's eyes as he learned new things, and the gratitude on the faces of the children he helped, brought Richard a satisfaction he'd never experienced in his years as a successful businessman. One afternoon, as he watched, Luke engrossed in a math lesson, Richard was approached by Mrs. Beatrice. You have a gift, you know, she commented. The kids respond really well to you. Richard smiled, feeling a mix of pride and humility. They teach me more than I teach. Them, actually. Mrs. Beatrice nodded, understanding. Richard, I've been thinking. We have an opening for an educational projects coordinator. It's a paid position with housing possibilities. Would you consider it? The world seemed to stop for a moment. Richard felt as if a huge weight was being lifted from his shoulders. A real chance to start over, to have a roof over his head, to continue helping. I don't know what to say, he stammered, tears forming in his eyes. Say yes, Mrs. Beatrice smiled. You deserve this chance, Richard, and these kids deserve someone like you. That night, as he shared the news with Luke, Richard saw the boy's face light up with pure joy. See? Luke exclaimed, hugging him tightly. I told you things would get better. Lying in his bed at the NGO's shelter, Richard reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him here. From tycoon to homeless, from desperate to educator, and now about to face his past head-on. Each step, each challenge, had shaped him, transforming him into the person he was now. With a smile on his lips, Richard fell asleep, eager for the dawn that would bring not just a new day, but a new chapter in his life. A chapter filled with purpose, gratitude, and, above all, hope. The months that followed brought a remarkable transformation in Richard and Luke's lives. The former businessman, now the educational projects coordinator at the New Horizons NGO, threw himself into his new role. His leadership and organizational skills, once used to build a corporate empire, were now directed toward creating opportunities for children and youth in vulnerable situations. Luke, in turn, flourished in the school environment. His natural intelligence, combined with the determination of someone who had known the hardships of the streets, made him one of the most dedicated students in his class. Watching the boys' progress became one of Richard's greatest joys. On a sunny Saturday morning, Richard and Luke walked through Central Park, enjoying a rare moment of leisure. Richard, Luke began hesitantly, do you think I could ever be like you? Have an important job, help people? Richard smiled, feeling a wave of pride and affection for the boy. Luke, I'm sure you can be much more. You have a huge heart and a strength that few adults have. The boy smiled, but his eyes revealed a shadow of worry. But what if my past holds me back? Will people always see me as the street kid? Richard stopped, placing his hands on Luke's shoulders. Listen carefully, what we've been through doesn't define us, but it strengthens us. Your past is part of who you are, but it doesn't limit who you can become. The words seemed to calm Luke, but they sparked reflections in Richard about his own past. As he watched families and couples enjoying the park, a familiar figure caught his attention. Across the lake, walking with a group of well-dressed executives, was Charles Anderson, his former business partner and the man Richard believed was responsible for his downfall. Richard's heart raced. Memories of his former life flooded his mind. The negotiations, the betrayals, the sudden fall. For a moment, he felt a wave of anger and resentment he hadn't experienced in a long time. Luke, noticing the sudden change in Richard's demeanor, tugged at his sleeve. "Are you okay? You went pale all of a sudden." Richard took a deep breath, forcing himself to compose. "I'm fine, Luke. I just saw someone who reminded me of the past." The boy followed Richard's gaze, observing the group of executives. "Those men in suits, do you know them?" "Knew them," Richard replied, his voice laden with conflicting emotions. "In another life." That night, alone in his small apartment, provided by the NGO, Richard found himself battling thoughts that hadn't tormented him in a long time. The sight of Charles, seemingly prosperous and carefree, reopened old wounds. He found himself browsing the internet, searching for news about his former company. The results surprised him. The company was embroiled in corruption scandals, and Charles Anderson was at the center of the investigations. Part of Richard felt a bitter satisfaction. Another part, however, was ashamed of that feeling. Wasn't this what he had taught Luke, that the past shouldn't define the present? In the days that followed, Richard struggled to stay focused on his work at the NGO. His colleagues noticed his distraction, but attributed it to the natural fatigue of someone so dedicated. It was during a meeting with potential donors that Richard's past and present collided unexpectedly. Among the businessmen present was none other than Michael Roberts, an old business rival. When their eyes met, Richard saw recognition in Michael's eyes, followed by a mix of surprise and respect. After the presentation, Michael approached him. "Richard Miller, never thought I'd see you in a place like this." Richard braced for hostility, but Michael's tone was genuinely curious. "Life takes us down unexpected paths, Michael," Richard replied, trying to maintain his composure. Michael nodded, thoughtful. "I heard about what happened. Many believed you were behind the fraud, but I always thought there was more to the story." Michael's words caught Richard by surprise. "You didn't believe the accusations?" "Let's just say I know Charles Anderson well enough to be suspicious," Michael replied. "Richard, I know we weren't exactly friends, but if you want to share your side, I'm willing to listen." Michael's offer opened a door Richard thought was closed forever. In the days that followed, they met several times. Richard, initially hesitant, began to share his story. The manipulations, the forged documents, Charles's betrayal. Michael, in turn, revealed information about the ongoing investigations. "Richard, your testimony could be crucial, not just to expose the truth, but to clear your name." The possibility of redemption was tempting, but Richard found himself torn. Getting involved would mean diving back into the world he'd left behind. It would mean exposing himself to the media, to judgments. More importantly, it would mean risking the new life he'd built, his work at the NGO, his relationship with Luke. One night, as he helped Luke with his homework, the boy noticed his preoccupation. "What's wrong, Richard? You've been so thoughtful lately." Richard hesitated but decided to be honest. "Luke, sometimes the past comes back to challenge us. I'm facing a tough decision." The boy looked at him with wisdom beyond his years. "You always tell me to face challenges head-on. Maybe it's time to follow your own advice." Luke's simple words resonated deeply with Richard. He realized that to truly embrace his future, he needed to make peace with his past. That night, Richard made his decision. He would face his past, not for revenge or redemption, but to finally turn the page and move forward. The path would be difficult, but he wouldn't be alone. With Luke, his colleagues at the NGO, and surprisingly unexpected allies like Michael, Richard prepared for the next chapter of his journey. A journey that promised not just justice, but a chance to unite his past and present into a story of transformation and hope. Richard's decision to confront his past set off a series of events that would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. In the weeks that followed, he worked tirelessly with Michael Roberts and a team of lawyers, gathering evidence and preparing his testimony against Charles Anderson and the others involved in the scheme that had brought him down. The process was exhausting. Sleepless nights reliving painful details, reviewing old documents and facing memories he'd rather have forgotten, consumed much of his time and energy. Richard struggled to maintain his routine at the NGO, but the fatigue was evident. Mrs. Beatrice, noticing his exhaustion, called him into her office for a talk. "Richard," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "we're worried about you. I know you're dealing with issues from your past, but you can't forget to take care of yourself in the present." Richard sighed, running a hand through his now graying hair. "I know, Beatrice, it's just that the deeper I go into this, the more I realize how much I've lost. Not just money and status, but years of my life." Beatrice looked at him with understanding. "But think about all you've gained too. The work here, your relationship with Luke, the person you've become. That's priceless." Beatrice's words resonated with Richard. She was right, of course. Even with all the challenges, his life now had a purpose it had never had before. That night, as he helped Luke with a school project, Richard decided to be honest with the boy about what was happening. "Luke," he began hesitantly, "remember when I told you about facing the past? Well, that's what I'm doing now. I'm trying to prove that I was wrongly accused of things I didn't do." Luke's eyes widened. "Does that mean you could be rich again?" The question caught Richard off guard. "I don't know, Luke, but that's not what matters. What I want is to clear my name and maybe help others who've been wronged." Luke was thoughtful for a moment. "What if you become famous again? Will you still live here? Will you still be my friend?" The vulnerability in Luke's voice broke Richard's heart. He pulled the boy into a tight hug. "Luke, listen to me. No matter what happens, you're the most important thing in my life now. Nothing will change that, understand?" The boy nodded, burying his face in Richard's chest. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster. The news that Richard Miller, the former tycoon once thought guilty of one of the biggest financial scandals in the country, was cooperating with the authorities, leaked to the press. Suddenly, his face was back in every newspaper and news broadcast. The New Horizons NGO found itself at the center of a media storm. Reporters swarmed the building, trying to get a statement from Richard or anyone connected to him. Mrs. Beatrice, with her diplomatic skills, managed to keep the situation under control, but the stress was palpable. Richard felt torn. On one hand, the opportunity to clear his name and expose the truth was something he'd yearned for years. On the other, the invasion of his privacy and the impact on his new life worried him deeply. One afternoon, as he left a meeting with the lawyers, Richard was surprised by a familiar figure, Claire, his ex-wife. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling, I saw you on TV. I could hardly believe it." The encounter was tense, laden with unresolved emotions. Claire expressed regret for abandoning him, explaining that she'd been manipulated into believing in his guilt. Richard, though hurt, found the strength to forgive her. "Claire," he said softly, "we all make mistakes. What's important is to learn from them and move forward." The conversation with Claire, though emotionally exhausting, brought Richard a sense of closure he didn't know he needed. As the case progressed, the evidence against Charles Anderson and his accomplices piled up. Richard found himself at the center of one of the biggest corporate corruption trials in the country. His testimony was crucial, and the pressure was immense. On the eve of his official testimony, Richard had a heartfelt conversation with Luke and Mrs. Beatrice. "Tomorrow everything could change," he explained. "If my testimony is accepted, my name will be cleared. There could be financial compensation, job offers. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, my heart is here. With you, with the NGO, with the work we do." Mrs. Beatrice smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Richard, you've become much more than a coordinator to us. You're family, and family sticks together no matter what." Luke, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "You're going to be my hero twice. Once for getting me off the streets, and again for taking on the suits." The boy's simple words brought tears to Richard's eyes. He realized that regardless of the trial's outcome, he'd already gained something far more valuable than any fortune, a true family. That night, as he prepared for the decisive day ahead, Richard reflected on his journey. From tycoon to homeless, from desperate to educator, and now about to face his past head-on, each step, each challenge had shaped him, transforming him into the person he was now. With renewed determination, Richard lay down, ready to face whatever fate had in store for him. Tomorrow would be a new chapter, not just in his life, but in the story of everyone his journey had touched. The day of the testimony dawned grey, as if the very sky of New York sensed the importance of the moment. Richard woke up before sunrise, his mind a storm of thoughts and emotions. Luke watched him, trying to hide his concern. "It's going to be okay," the boy said, more to convince himself than to comfort Richard. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Lawyers from both sides moved like pieces in a complex chess game. Charles Anderson, his former partner, sat at the defense table, his face a mask of disdain and arrogance. When Richard was called to testify, a deathly silence fell over the room. His voice, initially shaky, gained strength as he began to recount the details of the fraud, the financial manipulations, the forged documents. Michael Roberts, sitting discreetly in the back of the courtroom, watched every word, every nuance of Richard's narrative. Documentary evidence, incriminating emails, and testimonies from former employees corroborated every claim. Charles Anderson tried to discredit Richard, insinuating that he was just a bitter loser seeking revenge. But the evidence was too solid to ignore. During a recess, Richard was approached by a journalist. "How do you feel about publicly exposing all these details?" Richard took a deep breath. "It's not about revenge, it's about truth and justice." The hours of testimony dragged on, each revelation adding another brick to what seemed to be the end of Charles Anderson's empire. Documents proving money laundering, tax evasion, and corporate fraud were presented. At the end of the day, Richard left the courtroom exhausted, but with a sense of relief. Luke was waiting for him outside, anxious. "So?" the boy asked, barely containing his excitement. "Now we wait," Richard replied, forcing a tired smile. In the days that followed, the media talked of nothing else. Richard found himself back in the spotlight, but this time as a sort of whistleblower, an unlikely hero who had exposed a criminal scheme. The New Horizons NGO began receiving donations from businessmen impressed by Richard's integrity. Mrs. Beatrice called him for a talk. "You understand the impact of what you've done, don't you?" she said, her eyes shining with pride. "Not just for your personal life, but for all the people who were harmed by this scheme." Richard nodded, still, processing everything. His life had completely changed in a matter of months. From a bankrupt businessman to a homeless man, from a social educator to a key witness in one of the biggest corporate corruption cases in the country. One afternoon, he received an unexpected call. It was his former lawyer, with news that would leave him stunned. "Richard," he began, "the judge is considering not only clearing you of the charges, but also awarding you significant compensation for all the damages caused." The possibility of recovering part of his former fortune left him initially stunned. But Richard had learned much about the true value of things during his journey. That night, talking to Luke, he shared his reflections. "You know, Luke," he said, "a few months ago, the idea of getting money back would have been everything to me. Today, I see that true wealth is something completely different." Luke looked at him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "In the people we love, in the work we do, in the possibility of helping others," Richard replied, hugging the boy. The final court decision came weeks later. Richard was fully acquitted, and Charles Anderson was convicted on multiple counts of corporate fraud. The sentence was exemplary, sending a clear message about impunity in the business world. With the compensation, Richard could easily have returned to his former life of luxury. But his choice surprised everyone. He donated most of the money to the New Horizons NGO, ensuring resources to expand educational projects. He bought a simple house in a quiet neighborhood where he could live with Luke and continue his social work. "We're starting a new family," he told Luke, handing him the keys to the new house. The boy hugged him tightly, tears in his eyes. "Our family," he corrected. Richard's life had completely transformed. He was no longer the ambitious businessman who saw success only in numbers and assets. Now he saw wealth in the ability to transform lives, to give opportunities, to make a difference. And as he watched Luke playing in the small garden of their new home, Richard knew he had found something far more valuable than any fortune: purpose. The new lives of Richard and Luke settled into an almost surreal harmony. The simple house, located in a middle-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, became much more than a home. It was a symbol of a fresh start, of renewed hope. Luke had transformed completely. His school performance was exemplary, and his story began to inspire other young people in the community. Teachers described him as a brilliant student, with a maturity that went far beyond his years. One morning during breakfast, Luke shared exciting news. "Richard," he said, almost bouncing, "I've been invited to participate in a research program at the university." Richard felt his heart overflow with pride. "Tell me everything," he encouraged. The project was aimed at young people from underprivileged communities, offering mentorship and opportunities for scientific development. Luke would be one of the few students selected, an impressive feat for someone who, less than 2 years ago, had been living on the streets. As Luke spoke animatedly about the project, Richard watched the boy. His transformation was almost miraculous, from a street kid to a potential young scientist. Every word, every gesture from Luke was living proof that opportunities can change destinies. At work, Richard continued his mission at the New Horizons NGO. His experience and the lessons he'd learned had made him an inspiring leader. The educational projects grew, reaching more and more young people in vulnerable situations. Mrs. Beatrice called him for an important meeting. "Richard, we want to expand our work. Would you be able to lead a national education project for at-risk youth?" The proposal was challenging. It would mean more travel, being away from Luke for longer periods. But Richard saw in it an opportunity to amplify the positive impact they had started. While considering the proposal, he received an unexpected call. It was Michael Roberts, his former business rival, now an unlikely ally. "Richard," Michael began, "I'm setting up a social investment fund. I want you to be part of the advisory board." The offer was tempting. Using his business knowledge to create social impact, something Richard would never have imagined in his former life. That night, he talked to Luke about the possibilities that were arising. "What if I accept this offer?" Richard asked. "It means more travel, more responsibilities." Luke looked at him with impressive maturity. "It means more chances to help other people. Isn't that what you've always taught me?" The boy's wisdom surprised him once again. Richard realized how Luke had become not just his adopted son, but his greatest teacher. Days later, a surprise awaited Richard. Claire, his ex-wife, showed up at his new home. Their children, Luke and Marina, now teenagers, accompanied her. "I came to apologize," she said, "for everything, for not believing in you before." The encounter was tense at first, but gradually turned into an honest conversation about forgiveness and new beginnings. Marina, shy, approached Luke. "My dad told me about you, about how you and Richard met." Luke, always kind, smiled. "Want to see my research project?" The connection between the step-siblings was a moment of hope for Richard and Claire. Perhaps it was possible to rebuild bonds, not as they were before, but in a new and more mature way. Michael Roberts kept his promise. The social fund began operating, financing educational projects in underprivileged communities. Richard was instrumental in selecting and monitoring the projects. One afternoon, during a meeting, Michael surprised him. "You know, Richard, I always saw you as a competitor. Now I see you as a partner, as someone who truly understands what's important." Richard smiled. Life had taken unexpected turns, turning rivals into allies, pain into purpose. Luke continued to shine in his research project. His work on education in underprivileged communities caught the attention of university professors. Scholarships began to appear, opening horizons that had seemed impossible just a few years before. At night, sitting on his porch, watching Luke study, Richard reflected on his journey. From an ambitious businessman to a transformed man, his story was a testament to how life can take us down unexpected paths. "Hey, Luke," he called, "come see this." The boy approached, and together they watched the sunset over New York. Not as they had years ago from a distant and inaccessible mansion, but as a family, united by love, hope, and the possibility of making a difference. The city painted itself in orange and red, promising a new dawn. Just like the lives of Richard and Luke. Time passed, and Luke grew into a promising young man. His scientific work on education in vulnerable communities gained national recognition. Scholarships, invitations to conferences, and even a possible international publication were on his horizon. Richard watched Luke's growth with a mix of paternal pride and admiration. The boy he had found on the streets of New York was now preparing to become an agent of social change. One morning during breakfast, Luke shared news that would change the course of his life. "I've been invited to a scientific exchange program in the United States," he announced, his hands slightly trembling. Richard felt a mix of emotions. Pride for his son's achievement, but also fear of losing him. "That's amazing, Luke. Tell me more." The program was offered by a prestigious university, focused on research in education and social development. Luke would be one of the few Brazilians selected, an extraordinary feat for someone with his background. As they discussed the details, Richard's phone rang. It was Mrs. Beatrice with a proposal that would leave him stunned. "We want you to lead our international expansion," she said. "Our work at the NGO needs to go beyond Brazilian borders." The coincidence was almost comical. While Luke prepared for an opportunity in the United States, Richard would get the chance to expand social work globally. In the days that followed, preparations for Luke's trip began. Documents, passport, tickets, every detail was meticulously planned. Richard wanted to make sure his son had everything he needed. Claire and her children got involved in the process. Marina, who had developed a close relationship with Luke, helped with the preparations. The family, once fragmented, now united around a common goal. One night, the eve of Luke's departure, Richard called him for a serious talk. "I'm proud of you," he began, his voice choked with emotion. "But I also want you to know, no matter where you are, you'll always have a home here." Luke hugged him tightly. "You taught me all of this. Every achievement of mine is yours too." Guarulhos airport was packed on the day of departure. Family, friends from the NGO, and even local journalists came to honor Luke's journey. His research project had gained media attention, symbolizing the possibility of social transformation through education. Michael Roberts also attended. "This boy," he told Richard, "he represents the hope we talked about so much, a generation capable of breaking cycles of vulnerability." At the moment of farewell, Luke handed Richard an envelope. "Promise you'll only open it after I board," he instructed. Inside the envelope was an emotional letter. Luke recounted his journey, from the boy on the streets to that moment. He thanked Richard not just for saving him, but for teaching him the true meaning of family, love, and purpose. "You didn't just adopt me," Luke wrote. "You gave me wings to fly." Richard's tears wet the paper. His personal transformation gained its deepest meaning in that moment. With Luke's departure, Richard immersed himself in the NGO's new international project. Travels, meetings, planning, his world expanded beyond Brazilian borders. Mrs. Beatrice watched him with pride. "You've turned your pain into purpose," she said. "First with Luke, now with this global project." Months passed. Luke sent detailed reports of his research, heartfelt letters, photos of his new life. Richard followed every achievement with a mix of longing and immense joy. An unexpected call surprised him. It was the dean of the university where Luke was studying. "Mr. Miller," he began, "your son has just developed a revolutionary project on education in vulnerable communities. We want to present it at an international conference." Richard felt his heart overflow. The boy he had found on the streets of New York would now be introduced as a promising researcher at a world conference. Life had given them both a second chance, an opportunity to turn pain into hope, failure into success, loneliness into family. And as he watched the sunset from his office, Richard smiled. His journey was far from over. In fact, it seemed like it was just beginning. Time continued, its relentless march, Luke, now a young researcher recognized internationally, kept in close contact with Richard, sharing every achievement, every discovery in his academic journey. Richard, in turn, had become a global reference in social projects. His lectures and work with the New Horizons NGO inspired institutions around the world. The transformation of his life had become an example of resilience and purpose. One morning, as he prepared documents for an international conference, Richard received an unexpected call. On the other end of the line, the voice of Charles Anderson. His former partner sounded defeated. "I need to talk to you," Charles said, his former arrogance replaced by a tone of pleading. The meeting was set at a discreet cafe in downtown New York. Richard arrived punctually, his calm demeanor contrasting with Charles's restlessness. "I've come to ask for help," Charles began, avoiding direct eye contact with Richard. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Richard. The man who had brought him to ruin, who had destroyed his business life, was now seeking his aid. Charles revealed that, after serving part of his sentence, he was struggling to reintegrate socially. Without a job, his reputation in tatters, he found himself on the margins of everything he had once built. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Charles said. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need a chance to start over." Richard listened, attentively. Years ago, he might have felt bitter satisfaction at seeing his former partner fallen. Now he saw only a broken man seeking redemption. "What do you plan to do?" Richard asked, his voice free of judgment. Charles explained that he wanted to work on social projects, to use his business knowledge to help communities. The same transformation Richard had experienced years before. After long hours of conversation, Richard made a decision that would surprise many. He offered Charles a job opportunity in one of the NGO's projects in a distant city, where he could start over without the weight of his past. "It won't be easy," Richard warned. "You'll have to prove your worth every day." Charles nodded, tears in his eyes. Humility had replaced his former arrogance. That night, Richard shared the decision with Luke during a video call. The young researcher listened attentively, impressed by his father's capacity for forgiveness. "How can you do that?" Luke asked. "After all he did." Richard smiled. "Because true strength isn't in seeking revenge, but in giving second chances." Life continued to surprise them. Marina, Claire's daughter, had graduated in law and now worked on social justice projects. Her focus was on cases of child vulnerability, inspired by Luke's story. Claire, who had gradually reconnected with Richard, had become an important collaborator in education projects. Her experience in public relations was crucial for raising funds and visibility for social initiatives. One afternoon, during a meeting at the NGO, Mrs. Beatrice surprised him with a proposal. "We want to write a book about your story," she said. "Not as a personal success story, but as a guide to social transformation." Richard initially hesitated. Exposing his journey publicly wasn't something that appealed to him, but he understood that his story could inspire others to believe in the possibility of a new beginning. The writing process became a journey of self-discovery. Richard revisited each moment of his fall, each challenge, each lesson. Luke helped him, bringing perspectives from his own experience. Michael Roberts, who had become not just a partner in social business but a true friend, helped him organize the chapters. "Your story," Michael said, "is about how we lose everything to discover what truly matters." The book, when published, became a phenomenon, not for glamour or sensationalism, but for its genuine message of hope and transformation. At a book signing event, Richard looked out at the audience. He was surrounded by people whose lives his story had touched. Young people from underprivileged communities, businessmen seeking purpose, families who had found inspiration in his journey. Luke, now a respected young researcher, was by his side. Claire and Marina in the front row. Charles, working quietly on a social project far away, represented the possibility of redemption. Richard realized that his true wealth wasn't in money or status. It was in the lives he had touched, in the opportunities he had created, in the love he had found when all seemed lost. The final chapter of Richard's journey unfolded as a perfect synthesis of his transformation. Now with completely grey hair but with a brighter spark in his eyes than ever, he watched the world he had helped build. Luke, his son by choice and love, had become an internationally renowned researcher. His studies on education in vulnerable communities were a global reference, but more than academic titles, Luke kept alive the purpose Richard had taught him, to use knowledge to transform lives. On a Sunday morning, during a family breakfast, Luke revealed his next big mission. "I'm going to create a foundation," he announced, "focused on giving scholarships to young people from underprivileged communities, just like I was once." Richard felt his heart overflow. The cycle of hope was coming full circle. The boy he had found on the streets of New York would now be responsible for opening doors for other young people. Claire and Marina were also present. The family, once fragmented, now united around a common purpose. Marina, a lawyer specializing in social rights, had already helped hundreds of young people in vulnerable situations. The New Horizons NGO had become a global movement. Projects on different continents brought education, opportunities and hope to marginalized communities. Richard, who had once been a businessman focused solely on profits, was now recognized as a social transformer. Charles Anderson, the man who had once brought him to ruin, continued his work of redemption in a social project in the interior of the Northeast. His transformation was living proof that change is always possible. During an international conference, Richard was honored for his journey. As he took the stage, he looked out at the audience and saw faces of all ages, backgrounds, and stories. "I'm not here to talk about success," he began his speech. "I'm here to talk about hope, about how it's possible to start over, about how each of us can be an agent of transformation." His words echoed beyond the auditorium, gaining worldwide attention. The man who had once been considered a failure was now a symbol of resilience. Michael Roberts, his former business rival, now his partner and friend, hugged him after the speech. "You've changed not just your life," Michael said, "but the lives of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people." That night at home, Richard reflected on his journey. From the mansion to the shelter, from despair to hope, each step had been necessary. Each pain had been a lesson. Luke found him deep in thought. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" Richard smiled. "About life, about how everything connects." At that moment, they received news that the Luke Foundation had approved its first scholarships. Young people from underprivileged communities would now have the chance Luke had had years ago. The phone rang. It was Mrs. Beatrice, his mentor and friend of so many years. "Richard," she said, "we've just received the largest funding in the NGO's history. We can expand our projects to 50 more communities." The call represented more than an institutional success. It represented the realization of a dream that had begun with a chance encounter on the streets of New York, when Richard was just a lost man and Luke, a boy fighting for survival. As night fell over New York, Richard looked out the window. The city that had once seen him fall was now a witness to his rebuilding. Not just his personal rebuilding, but the rebuilding of lives, of hopes, of futures. "We're just getting started," he murmured to himself. Luke, who was by his side, held his hand. No words were needed. The love, the respect, the shared purpose said it all. Life, in all its complexity, had transformed into a tapestry of hope. And Richard was ready for the next chapters of this story.